1:09 a.m. Low Earth orbit. At an altitude of 550 kilometers above the Earth's surface, a constellation of 3,847 Starlink broadband satellites was executing its continuous orbital maintenance routine. Small thruster adjustments, solar panel orientation updates, inter-satellite laser link calibrations. The constellation provided internet connectivity to approximately 3.2 million subscribers globally. It also provided, under a classified service agreement with the Department of Defense, encrypted tactical communications, imagery relay, and GPS timing augmentation to U.S. military and allied forces in 14 active operational theaters. Since February 2022, Starlink terminals had become the primary tactical communications architecture for the Ukrainian military. More recently, the terminals had been distributed to Taiwan's ground defense forces under a bilateral security assistance program. The satellites that provided civilian streaming video and agricultural precision guidance were the same satellites that provided artillery targeting data and encrypted command communications to forces that the People's Liberation Army was planning to engage. This dual-use reality had been the subject of classified PRC National Security Council deliberations for 19 months. The PLA Strategic Support Forces Space Electronic Countermeasures Directorate had developed a system designated in U.S. intelligence reporting as Silkworm-3, a ground-based high-power phased array capable of projecting a focused radio frequency beam of sufficient intensity to produce non-recoverable damage to the command and control electronics of a Starlink satellite if maintained on target for between 14 and 22 seconds. The system could repoint its beam between targets in approximately 8 seconds. It operated on frequencies adjacent to the Starlink constellation's communication bands, producing interference that was spectrally close enough to background noise that automated anomaly detection in Starlink's ground operations center would register initial targeting events as equipment noise rather than directed engagement. The Silkworm-3 system had a theoretical engagement rate of approximately 3 satellites per minute sustained over a 40-minute operational window, before thermal management requirements interrupted operations. In 40 minutes, the system could potentially render approximately 120 satellites non-functional. 120 satellites from a constellation of 3,847 represented approximately 3.1% of total Starlink capacity. It would not render the constellation inoperable. It would not eliminate the service. What 120 precisely selected satellites from specific orbital planes could eliminate was the constellation's coverage geometry over a 2,000-kilometer geographic corridor corresponding to the Taiwan Strait and the Western Pacific approaches. The coverage zone that provided Taiwan's ground forces with their primary tactical communications relay architecture. The engagement had been planned for a specific orbital window during which the 120 target satellites would be simultaneously accessible to the Silkworm-3 beam geometry. That window occurred once every 89 minutes. The window that began at 1:09 a.m. on this particular date had been selected because it coincided with a period when SpaceX's ground operations center in Redmond, Washington was operating with minimum staff. A Thursday night at 10:09 p.m. Pacific Time, mid-shift change, 60% of the full operations complement present. At 1:09:07 a.m., the first Starlink satellite entered Silkworm-3's engagement beam. The satellite, Unit 3841 in the constellation's internal designation, registered a power anomaly in its command and control module at 1:09:22 a.m., which was 15 seconds into the beam engagement. The anomaly triggered an automated diagnostic that transmitted a telemetry packet to the Redmond Operations Center at 1:09:24 a.m. The Operations Center's anomaly monitoring system received the packet, assessed it as a probable power regulation transient, and logged it as a maintenance item for morning review. The satellite was functionally impaired, but its commercial communications payload continued operating. Its military relay function was offline. The second engagement began at 1:09:30 a.m. The third at 1:09:55 a.m. Each engagement produced a similar telemetry packet. Each packet was assessed by the automated system as a probable power transient. By 1:14 a.m., 5 minutes into the operation, 15 satellites had been engaged. 14 had transmitted anomaly packets. One had not transmitted anything after the engagement, which meant either that it had been completely incapacitated or that its telemetry transmitter had been the specific component damaged. The operations center's automated system had logged 14 maintenance items and 1 monitoring gap. It had not escalated any of them. At 1:17 a.m., 8 minutes into the operation, a SpaceX operations engineer who had been monitoring the anomaly queue as part of his shift handover review noticed that the 14 maintenance items logged in the preceding 8 minutes were not distributed randomly across the constellation. They were clustered in 3 specific orbital planes that passed over the Western Pacific. He had been with SpaceX for 3 years and had processed approximately 40,000 satellite anomaly events. He had never seen a geographic clustering of power anomalies in this pattern before. He escalated to the shift supervisor at 1:17:33 a.m. The shift supervisor looked at the distribution plot for 11 seconds. Then she reached for the dedicated U.S. Space Force liaison line that had been installed in the Redmond Operations Center 7 months earlier. Under a classified partnership agreement between SpaceX and the Department of Defense for exactly this category of situation, the call connected to Space Delta 9, the DoD's Commercial Space Integration Unit, at 1:17:52 a.m. The Space Delta 9 duty officer received the SpaceX report at 1:17:55 a.m. and had the constellation's orbital geometry and the anomaly distribution on his display within 90 seconds. His assessment was transmitted to USSPACECOM and to the NSC duty officer at 1:19:27 a.m., 10 minutes and 20 seconds after the first satellite had been engaged. The assessment used the phrase directed engagement of commercial space assets, a phrase that had been defined in a classified DoD policy document as a hostile act under international law when directed against commercial satellites providing services under a DoD support agreement. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 established that outer space was the province of all mankind, that no state could claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, and that states were responsible for the national activities of non-governmental entities in space. The treaty had not been written with commercial satellite constellations of 3,847 units in mind. Its Article 9 prohibited interference with the activities of other states' parties in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. But the definition of peaceful was contested, and the activities of a commercial operator providing tactical military communications relay were not straightforwardly characterizable as peaceful exploration in the treaty's original sense. The 1972 Liability Convention established liability for damage caused by a state's space objects to the space objects of another state, but directed energy engagement that produced non-kinetic functional impairment rather than physical fragmentation occupied a category the convention's drafters had not specifically addressed. 42 different legal analyses had been produced by U.S. government lawyers since 2019, addressing the question of what international law said about directed energy engagement of commercial satellites. Not a single one had produced a clear answer. They had produced 42 different nuanced positions that collectively demonstrated the legal architecture's inability to keep pace with the operational reality. The legal situation was novel in a way that exceeded the novelty of most novel legal situations. Starlink was not a U.S. government system. Its satellites were not U.S. military assets. They were commercial property of a private corporation, SpaceX, incorporated in Delaware and headquartered in California. The DoD support agreement gave U.S. military forces priority access to Starlink's capacity, but it did not make the satellites government property or place them under the legal protections that applied to U.S. military assets under the laws of armed conflict. China's position, when it was eventually articulated through official channels, would be consistent with its long-held view. It was engaging a commercial communication system that happened to be providing material support to forces that China considered to be conducting hostile operations against Chinese interests. It was not engaging U.S. military assets. It was disrupting commercial infrastructure that had been voluntarily placed at the service of hostile actors. The U.S. position, when it was articulated, was the opposite. The DoD support agreement made the satellites functionally military assets for the purposes of the international law protections that applied to military communications infrastructure. Engaging them was an act of aggression against U.S. military communications capability. Both positions had legal support. Neither had definitive precedent. The satellites being engaged at 1:09 a.m. were the first time the question had been posed in an operational rather than a theoretical context. USSPACECOM's operational response to the engagement was constrained by the same legal ambiguity that was being processed in the NSC. The U.S. had no deployed capability to physically protect Starlink satellites from ground-based directed energy engagement. The satellites were too numerous, their orbits too dynamic, and the engagement beam's undetectable nature too complete for a conventional defensive intercept approach. What the U.S. could do was respond asymmetrically. At 1:23 a.m., USSPACECOM authorized SpaceX to implement its constellation's Defensive Frequency Agility Protocol, a capability built into the Starlink system software architecture specifically because the company's engineers had anticipated directed energy interference as a threat vector. The protocol automatically shifted each satellite's command and control electronics to a frequency band outside the Silkworm. 3 systems operational parameters. The shift required a firmware update distributed to each satellite through the inter-satellite laser link network. A process that took between 4 and 11 minutes per satellite depending on its position in the link topology. The protocol had been developed over 14 months and had been tested in simulation 23 times. It had never been deployed against an actual directed energy engagement. At 1:23 a.m., it began deploying against a real one. Silkworm 3 had been engaging satellites for 14 minutes by the time the defensive protocol began implementing. 47 satellites had been engaged. 41 were confirmed non-functional in their military relay capacity. 6 were operating at degraded capacity. The constellation's coverage geometry over the Taiwan Strait was reduced to approximately 34% of its nominal capacity. As the firmware update propagated through the constellation from 1:23 a.m. onward, the satellites updating their frequency configuration became resistant to the Silkworm 3 beam. The system's operators in the PLA Strategic Support Force facility could observe the engagement effectiveness declining in real time. Satellites that should have been showing power anomaly telemetry were not. The Silkworm 3 engagement rate began dropping as more satellites completed the frequency shift. The system's operators attempted to compensate by shifting their beam to the new frequency band. The Silkworm 3 system's frequency agility was limited. It had been designed for a specific operational parameter set, and the Starlink defensive protocol had been designed to shift outside that parameter set. The attempt to follow the frequency shift required the Silkworm 3 operators to reconfigure their beam generation hardware, a process that took approximately 7 minutes and represented a gap in the engagement sequence. At 1:31 a.m., 22 minutes into the operation, Silkworm 3 resumed engagement attempts on the updated frequency. The effectiveness was significantly reduced. The Starlink firmware had shifted the command and control frequencies to a band where Silkworm 3's beam power was approximately 40% of its optimal level for producing non-recoverable damage. At 40% effectiveness, the engagement time per satellite increased from 14 to 22 seconds to approximately 35 to 55 seconds. At that rate, Silkworm 3 could engage approximately 50 satellites in the remaining 18 minutes of its operational window, compared to the 120 originally planned. At 1:37 a.m., The DoD's Space Rapid Capabilities Office transmitted an emergency tasking to the National Reconnaissance Office for a repositioning of 2 commercial-class signals intelligence satellites, whose orbital parameters placed them within collection range of the Silkworm 3 facility's radio frequency emissions during this operational window. The NRO redirected both satellites at 1:39 a.m. Their collection of the Silkworm 3 system's operational frequency configuration, beam pointing parameters, and engagement timing signatures would provide the technical intelligence required to further update the Starlink defensive protocol for the next engagement window. The window that would open again in 89 minutes. The broader intelligence picture that USSPACECOM's analysis team had assembled by 1:50 a.m. added context to the Silkworm 3 engagement that made it more concerning rather than less. The PLA Strategic Support Forces Space Electronic Countermeasures program had been tracked by U.S. intelligence for 29 months. The Silkworm 3 system had been assessed as operational for approximately 14 months, but its engagement parameters, specifically its ability to produce non-recoverable damage rather than temporary disruption, had not been confirmed until tonight. The previous intelligence assessments had placed Silkworm 3's effectiveness at lower power levels consistent with temporary signal disruption. Tonight's engagement had demonstrated that the system had been upgraded or that the previous assessment had been incorrect. 41 satellites confirmed non-functional represented a capability level significantly above what the intelligence community had projected. The system had been more effective than assessed. That discrepancy between what intelligence had projected and what operational reality had demonstrated was not new in the history of intelligence assessments. It was consistently unwelcome. The 89-minute window. The Silkworm 3 system operated on the orbital geometry of the Starlink constellation. Every 89 minutes, the same target satellites returned to the same relative position. The defensive firmware had closed the current window's engagement effectiveness significantly, but the PLA Strategic Support Forces operators had 89 minutes before the next window to adapt their own parameters in response to what they had observed. At 1:44 a.m., 35 minutes after the first satellite had been engaged, Silkworm 3 completed its operational window. Final assessment: 63 Starlink satellites non-functional in military relay capacity, 14 operating at degraded capacity. Constellation coverage over Taiwan Strait, approximately 61% of nominal, recovering to approximately 79% as adjacent orbital planes moved into coverage position over the following 40 minutes. Taiwan ground forces had experienced a 35-minute degraded communications period during which encrypted command relay traffic had been rerouted through lower bandwidth alternative links. The degradation had been operationally significant. It had not been operationally crippling. The constellation had 3,784 remaining functional satellites and the geometric flexibility to partially compensate for 63 losses. The Taiwan ground forces experience during the 35-minute degraded communications window had been transmitted to INDOPACOM through backup channels at 1:58 a.m. The assessment was clinical and precise. The degradation had forced a shift from the primary Starlink tactical relay to a combination of HF radio and commercial VSAT terminals for critical command traffic. The shift had produced communication latencies of between 4 and 11 seconds compared to the sub-second latency of the Starlink relay. Latencies that were operationally significant for time-sensitive fire mission coordination, but manageable for command and logistics traffic. The assessment also noted that the 35-minute window had not coincided with any active kinetic operations, and that the impact of a similar degradation event during an active engagement phase would need to be assessed against specific operational timelines. The clinical precision of the assessment did not obscure its implication. The Taiwan forces had experienced a communications degradation event consistent with what would be expected in the early phase of a major planned military operation, and the backup systems had performed at reduced but functional capacity. The degradation was an operational data point. It was also a test result. SpaceX transmitted a formal statement to the DoD's Commercial Space Liaison Office at 2:04 a.m. Confirmed directed engagement of 63 Starlink units. Cause assessed as ground-based directed energy. Defensive protocol implemented. Next orbital window in 54 minutes, requesting DoD guidance on response parameters for next window. SpaceX was asking the U.S. government what it wanted to do when the 89-minute clock ran out. The DoD's response was transmitted at 2:19 a.m. 15 minutes of NSC deliberation compressed into 3 guidance points. First, SpaceX was authorized to implement any technical defensive measure within the satellite's own engineering parameters, without further DoD approval, for all subsequent engagement windows. Second, the DoD was formally classifying the Silkworm 3 engagement as a hostile act against U.S. military communications infrastructure under the DoD Support Agreement's force protection provisions. Third, SpaceX was requested to maintain all telemetry data from engaged satellites in a forensic-grade archive for use in international legal proceedings. Time from first satellite engagement to SpaceX anomaly flag, 8 minutes. Time from anomaly flag to DoD alert, 10 minutes 20 seconds. Time from DoD alert to defensive protocol authorization, 3 minutes 33 seconds. Time from defensive protocol deployment to meaningful engagement reduction, 15 minutes. Total satellites non-functional, 63. Total satellites degraded, 14. Taiwan Strait coverage degradation peak, 66% reduction. Coverage recovery time, 40 minutes partial, 6 hours full recovery with orbital substitution. Legal classification of engagement, hostile act under DoD support agreement provisions. Chinese government official characterization, technical interference with commercial infrastructure. SpaceX DoD support agreement classification, classified. The classification was classified. The legal question it generated was not. The NRO satellite signals intelligence collection from the Silkworm 3 facility transmitted its first processed data package to USSPACECOM at 2:22 a.m., 43 minutes after the NRO redirect was authorized. 38 minutes of collection representing a near-complete capture of the Silkworm 3 system's operational frequency configuration after its adaptation to the Starlink defensive protocol. The technical intelligence package was transmitted to SpaceX's engineering team at 2:31 a.m., a classified data transfer that was explicitly permitted under the DoD Support Agreement's technical intelligence sharing provisions. The SpaceX engineers who received the package began immediately incorporating the new frequency parameters into the next generation of the defensive firmware update. The update would be ready for deployment before the next 89-minute engagement window opened. Whether its effectiveness would hold through a second engagement cycle, whether Silkworm 3 would adapt again in the window after that, was the question that no one in the loop could answer from the data available at 2:31 a.m. What they could answer was that the adaptation race was now running, and that it was running on an 89-minute clock. The 63 non-functional satellites would be replaced on SpaceX's next scheduled Falcon 9 launch, which was 19 days away. The firmware update that had reduced Silkworm 3's effectiveness by 60% would be updated before the next 89-minute window. The Silkworm 3 system would adapt its parameters in the same window. The engagement was not concluded. It had completed its first cycle. The 89-minute clock was running.